Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Goff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, I'm going to be talking about my Week 13 quarterback and tight end rankings for the 2023 fantasy football season. Over the course of today's episode, I'm covering all topics related to the quarterback and tight end positions, beginning with matchups, talking about which defenses thus far this season on average are allowing the most fantasy points to opposing tight ends and quarterbacks in order to identify the most advantageous matchups going into Week 13. After which, I'll transition into talking about my top 16 rankings at both positions, sharing with you guys my thought process and opinions on each individual player, while also presenting statistics in order to justify those overall rankings. Before we begin, a couple of announcements. Of course, if you're looking for a specific player, there are timestamps down in the description of the video. While you're down there, be sure to subscribe to the channel. We are very close to our goal of 82,000 subscribers. Thank you very much for all the support. Also, at the end of today's video, I'll be putting together a couple pick'em subs via Underdog Fantasy. For those of you who are trying to stay up to date on my latest rankings, be sure to go ahead, travel down to the description, and check out Underdog Fantasy. Because as of right now, if you sign up using code Andrew and make a first-time deposit minimum of $10, not only are you going to get the first-time deposit match, not only are you going to be able to go ahead and follow potentially the picks that we put together at the end of today's episode, but you'll get my rankings every single Sunday morning from my email directly to yours. These rankings are by position, by tier, flex rankings, half PPR, full PPR. So regardless of what you're doing on Sunday mornings, you have an advantage upon your league mates. Be sure to check out the right side of the screen to determine your eligibility based on your current location. And like I mentioned, we're going ahead and putting together a couple pick'em slips at the end of today's episode. You can take advantage of the new customer special by signing up today using code Andrew, making that first time deposit minimum of $10 with Dak Prescott 0.5 total yards. Thank you very much. Okay, so let's talk about tight end matchups going into Week 13. As you guys can see to the right side of the screen, we have 2023 tight end receiving statistics allowed. This is isolated between weeks 5 through 12 in terms of receiving statistics allowed receptions, receiving yards, and receiving touchdowns in a half PPR scoring format. We find that the Denver Broncos, Houston Texans, Los Angeles Chargers are the most advantageous matchups going into the given week, as they're allowing over 13 fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends. Now, as we progress throughout this entire list, the number continues to drop in terms of fantasy points per game allowed, and we get into some of the more difficult matchups, the more disadvantageous ones, where in some of these circumstances, we might want to avoid playing our tight ends. For example, even though Tyler Higbee's coming off a great week in which he had 2 receiving touchdowns, now he takes on the most difficult matchup at the tight end position, a matchup in which even guys like Mark Andrews has struggled going up against. That being said, I'll refer back to these over the course of today's episode. Just wanted to go ahead and present them. Let's get into talking about my top 16 tight end rankings, beginning with our number 1, Travis Kelce, who remains in the Kelce tier, the only player that truly deserves to be in this conversation. I mean, we named the tier after him, therefore he remains at the top of the list, taking on the Green Bay Packers this week. It's a no-brainer. You're obviously starting Travis Kelce. Our number 2, we have George Kittle. Prior to this last week's game against the Seattle Seahawks, in which he had a very underwhelming performance of 5 targets, 3 catches, 19 yards, and only 3.4 fantasy points, he was on a consecutive game streak of dominating for fantasy purposes. From week 7 through 11, he ranked as the number 7, 2, and 1 overall tight end throughout that span of time. I'm assuming because of the short week of going from Sunday into a Thursday game, it didn't create a great atmosphere for the potential of him. And on top of the fact that the 49ers had 3 rushing touchdowns within that game, it really did cap the potential of George Kittle going up against the Philadelphia Eagles, which of course tight ends have found a lot of success against. I'm expecting him to be a fantastic play and an impact player within this matchup. On number 3, we have Sam LaPorta at the tight end position. Sam LaPorta is coming off a week in which he found the end zone. That should have been 2 consecutive games in which he scored a touchdown a couple weeks back against the Chicago Bears. Unfortunately, Jared Goff on a high-low concept sent the ball in the direction of Amon-Ra St. Brown instead of in the back of the end zone wide open Sam LaPorta. But either way, they continue to utilize him at a high capacity. Coming off a week in which he had 8 targets, he takes on the New Orleans Saints that are the 4th best matchup at the tight end position, nearly allowing 13 fantasy points per game. I expect a lot of upside potentially here. Just a couple weeks back, we saw TJ Hawkinson dominate against this defense, so why not Sam LaPorta in an advantageous matchup? Our number 4 for this week is Trey McBride. The news that we heard earlier today from J.J. Watt, of all people, breaking news was that not only did Zach Ertz request his release from the Arizona Cardinals, but it was granted. So now Trey McBride season is full force for the remainder of the year. For those of you who have Trey McBride, expect him to continue to put out incredible performances as the number 1 tight end of this offense, and no one else coming in to impede his overall upside in comparison to someone like Dalton Kincaid, who will have Dawson Knox returning once we get to week 14. As of the last 3 games with Kyler Murray, Trey McBride has been able to garner a 23.5% target share within this offense. They take on the Pittsburgh Steelers, who as of the last 2 weeks have allowed 7 catches for 56 to David Njoku and 8 catches for 38 to Cincinnati Bengals tight ends. I'm expecting another big week here for Trey McBride. Our number 5 for this week, David Njoku. We were just mentioning him a moment ago. As of late, his overall opportunity share has been ridiculous. He is a focal point of this offense. In the last 6 games, these are his target counts on a per game basis: 9, 15, 9, 6, 8, and 9. What a ridiculous share that he's been able to get. 56 total targets in the last 6 games, nearly 10 targets per game on average. And now he has the potential of Joe Flacco taking over the starting quarterback position. And the reason why I believe that is so vital is because if you go back to last season, weeks 1 through 3, when Joe Flacco was the starting quarterback of the New York Jets, throughout that span of time, he targeted Tyler Conklin alone in these 3 games. 8 catches for 84, 6 catches for 40, 4 catches for 16 and a touchdown. The targets in those 3 games: 8 targets, 9 targets, 7 targets. He continues to love to utilize his tight ends, even going back to his days as the Baltimore Ravens starting quarterback with all the tight ends he had there. My expectation going forward, especially against the 8th best matchup at the position, taking on the Los Angeles Rams, is a great performance here from David Njoku, regardless of who's playing at quarterback. But if Joe Flacco is the guy, should be a fantastic day. Moving on to our number 6, we have Pat Freiermuth. He takes on the Arizona Cardinals, who of course just gave up a huge total of fantasy points to Tyler Higbee. But either way, we want to talk about Pat Freiermuth and what he was able to accomplish last week. 11 total targets, 9 receptions, 120 receiving yards. Those are career highs in terms of receptions and receiving yards for him. And hopefully the momentum is only just going to continue with him and Kenny Pickett finally finding their stride in the absence of Matt Canada as their offensive coordinator. Finally, Kenny Pickett, after weeks of not utilizing the middle of the field, continued to look in the direction of Pat Freiermuth over the middle. Last week against the Cincinnati Bengals, again, they were playing a lot of 2 high safeties over the middle of the field, being able to split the difference behind the linebackers, found himself a lot of success. Taking on the Arizona Cardinals this week, the Arizona Cardinals play the second most 2 high safety coverage in the National Football League. Could be another fantastic week here for Pat Freiermuth, assuming the opportunity is there. But again, over the middle of the field, he dominated, and that's exactly where we want him to go ahead and get utilization, considering Kenny Pickett has very rarely ventured throughout that entire territory in the absence of Pat Freiermuth. Moving on to our number 7, we have Dalton Schultz. So here's the thing about Dalton Schultz. Of course, he was on the injury report Wednesday and he didn't practice with a hamstring injury. Hopefully, he's going to be healthy for this upcoming weekend because he, in fact, does take on the Denver Broncos. That is the most advantageous matchup at the position. They're allowing 14.04 fantasy points per game since week 5 to opposing tight ends. As of late, they've allowed 7 catches for 61 and a touchdown to Cleveland Browns tight ends, 8 catches, 102 and a touchdown to Minnesota Vikings tight ends, and 5 catches for 51 and a touchdown to Buffalo Bills tight ends. Hawkinson, David Njoku, and even Harrison Bryant last week had themselves great performances. Dalton Kincaid, everyone is dominated against this defense. Hopefully Dalton Schultz is healthy and ready to go against this matchup. Our number 8 for this week, playing later tonight, is Jake Ferguson. Again, the issue that I have with Jake Ferguson is his inconsistency of play, but we always have the potential of him scoring a touchdown. I mean, prior to the last 2 games in which he's had lackluster performances, he had a 3 consecutive game streak coming off of the bye week in which he scored a receiving touchdown. A couple weeks back, we also saw Schumacher, the backup tight end, score a receiving touchdown within this offense. So really, there are just so many threats within this offense. Anybody can catch the ball. It could be a Turpin, it could be, Tolbert, a Gallup, a Cooks, or Dowdle. Anybody in this backup overall conversation who's not one of the primary players like a Pollard or Lamb or even Ferguson may end up catching a touchdown tonight. Either way, I'm hoping that he'll find himself opportunity down in the red zone in order to score tonight against the Seattle Seahawks. It's not the greatest overall matchup, but considering the offense he's associated with and how often the Dallas Cowboys score, he's got a pretty good shot of scoring tonight. Moving on to our number 9, speaking of scoring touchdowns, the touchdown king himself, we have Taysom Hill. In the last 27 regular season games, he has scored 16 total touchdowns, whether that's on the ground or through the air, receiving or passing. It does not matter. Taysom Hill is a monster in that overall category. Considering how many injuries are plaguing the offense of the New Orleans Saints, Michael Thomas, Rashid Shaheed, there's even the potential of Chris Olave missing this upcoming week, there would be a lot more utilization of Taysom Hill, not only as a receiver last week, 2 catches for 55 yards, not only as a passer, someone that can obviously make a play on any given week, but also as a rusher. Last week had himself 7 rushing attempts for 26 rushing yards. I would assume that number only increases if, in fact, the passing game isn't there with all the receiving targets injured. Moving on to our number 10, we have Evan Engram. The issue with Evan Engram is that he doesn't have extremely high upside, and again, he's not going to score touchdowns. So within a given week, we're just expecting him to score somewhere between like 7 to 10 fantasy points if we're lucky in a half PPR scoring format. In the last 5 games he's played with Zay Jones, he's only averaging 6.64 fantasy points per game. In the games in which he's played without Zay Jones, 8.2 fantasy points per game. So obviously his numbers are dipping based on the overall volume of opportunity going in his direction, as they're obviously utilizing another receiving option like Zay Jones in those overall matchups. Luckily, he takes on the Bengals. It's the 6th best matchup at the position. They're allowing 12.3 fantasy points per game since week 5. Moving on to our number 11, we have Cade Otton, another one of these tight ends in which they are super touchdown dependent. Sure, he's been able to get himself 4+ receptions in 5 of the last 6 games he has participated in, but when you're only catching the ball 4 catches for 45 yards, 6.5 fantasy points, that's not a great overall performance in a lot of these scenarios, but we'll take it. In this circumstance, taking on the Carolina Panthers, it should be a matchup in which, of course, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers are dominating. I expect Cade Otton to get himself his opportunity. He's just got to fall into the end zone to be fantasy relevant. Moving on to our number 12, we have Juwan Johnson, another one of these tight ends that is a streamer option that, again, is very much so touchdown dependent. He's coming off a week in which he was utilized a lot. 7 targets, 4 catches, 45 receiving yards, primarily because of Chris Olave and Rashid Shaheed going down in that game and Michael Thomas already being on the injured reserve. If we're going to miss all 3 of those wide receivers this week, which is a very good likelihood, of course, Juwan Johnson will be the primary threat within the receiving game, taking on the Detroit Lions, which again would be an advantageous matchup for him. Moving on to our number 13, we have Logan Thomas. Even though Logan Thomas this last week against the Dallas Cowboys didn't have himself a great overall game, 2 catches for 15 receiving yards, he typically, in a negative game script, is utilized heavily within this offense. Like I've mentioned yesterday with Terry McLaurin, and like I'll mention later with a guy like Sam Howell, the thumbnail of today's episode, Sam Howell in the last 6 games has had himself 42 or more passing attempts in terms of a base minimum. If they're going to continue to throw the ball at that kind of a volume, of course, Logan Thomas is going to get his opportunity. There's a reason why he has had 4 or more receptions in 5 of the last 6 games. Of course, last week being the one outlier that obviously didn't lead to 4+ receptions. We're hoping for another big week here from Logan Thomas. Moving on to our number 14, we have Kyle Pitts. I understand that Arthur Smith earlier this week did in fact say that Kyle Pitts is a big part of this offense and he's going to continue to get himself a lot of opportunity. As much as he continues to say things like this, I don't know if I can, completely trust him in those overall scenarios. Kyle Pitts hasn't had 5 receptions in a game since October 8th of 2023. It's been quite a while. So hopefully he'll get more opportunity. He's coming off a performance of 2 targets, 2 catches, 22 yards. They take on the Jets. It could be an advantageous matchup if they utilize him at a great capacity. I just don't know if they will. Moving on to our number 15, we have Gerald Everett. When he's healthy and in this offense, he's always a red zone threat. He has already demonstrated that for us over the course of the season. They also take on the New England Patriots. Again, this is a matchup in which the quarterback position typically finds a lot of success. And outside of Keenan Allen, there's going to have to be another threat within this offense that finds himself a lot of target opportunity. I'm expecting that to be Gerald Everett because outside of him, really, Jalen Guyton, Quentin Johnston not getting the job done. The final tight end I wanted to mention is Tyler Conklin. Again, even though it's Tim Boyle, still got himself 5 targets, 4 catches, 33 receiving yards last week, has an opportunity of taking on the Falcons at home this week. They're a pretty decent matchup, allowing 10.03 fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends. It's just a matter of getting opportunity and that leading to his overall success in a fantasy capacity throughout this bipocalypse. Okay, with this all covered, let's transition into talking about the quarterback matchups for this week. As you guys can see to the right side of the screen, we've gone ahead and isolated passing statistics from weeks 5 through 12 for these defenses and how much they've allowed to opposing quarterbacks. The Washington Commanders, Tampa Bay Buccaneers, Philadelphia Eagles, they are the best matchups at the quarterback position. Of course, the Washington Commanders above all, allowing a bunch of statistics on a per game basis in terms of passing touchdowns alone. Obviously, they haven't had a bye week throughout this entire span of time, but nonetheless, this bodes very well for someone like Tua Tagovailoa. Now, on the other end of this entire spectrum, we have some of the more difficult matchups. Of course, the Cleveland Browns, Matthew Stafford will have his hands full with a very difficult matchup. The Denver Broncos, of course, CJ Stroud is playing incredibly well for a rookie quarterback. Can he continue this momentum against a defense that has had more interceptions than passing touchdowns allowed since week 5? Time will tell. Now that we've covered all this, I'll refer back to these statistics over the course of today's video. Let's get into talking about my top 16 quarterback rankings, beginning with our number 1, Jalen Hurts. Jalen Hurts is coming off of a week in which he had 5 total touchdowns scored. But that statistic honestly isn't uncommon. He carries this team on his back. And over the course of the last 10 consecutive games, he's had himself a base minimum of 2 touchdowns per game, whether it's on the ground or through the air. I mean, specifically in the last 10 games, he has 11 rushing touchdowns. What a ridiculous number. Coming off a huge performance against the Buffalo Bills, now has an opportunity of taking on an NFC rival in the San Francisco 49ers, perhaps a precursor to the NFC Championship game. Should be a very exciting matchup between these two teams. I'm expecting Jalen Hurts to once again ball out. On number 2, we have Dak Prescott. Of course, Dak Prescott in the last 6 games has ranked as the number 1, 3, 2, 1, 16, and 4 in a standard 4-point per passing touchdown league. Again, in 5 of the last 6 games, he has been a top 4 quarterback in fantasy football. He's averaging 28.54 fantasy points per game since week 6. He's the number 1 overall quarterback throughout that entire span of time. He takes on the Seattle Seahawks later tonight. Thursday Night Football typically has been tricky games, but I do anticipate, considering, they've had a full week of rest, considering the last time they played was a Thursday, 7 days rest, they should be good to go in comparison from going from a Sunday to a Thursday. I'm expecting Dak Prescott to put together another great performance here. Our number 3 this week is Tua Tagovailoa. He takes on the best matchup at the position, taking on the Washington Commanders, who again are allowing 21.77 fantasy points per game in terms of passing statistics isolated. That's going to allow Tua Tagovailoa, of course, Tyreek Hill, Jalen Waddle to dominate within this given matchup. Obviously, many of us have concerns of the potential of this game script getting out of hand. Oftentimes, when the Miami Dolphins take an early lead, it leads to them running the ball heavily with Raheem Mostert and potentially the return of Devon Achane in the second half of games, and that leading to a lot of rushing touchdowns rather than Tua Tagovailoa being able to, extend his overall fantasy upside within passing touchdowns, passing yardage. Time will tell. Either way, last week's performance, those interceptions definitely did hurt his overall potential, but I do expect him to get back on track against an incredible matchup versus the Commanders. Moving on to our number 4, we have Patrick Mahomes. Patrick Mahomes has had himself 3 consecutive games of 2 passing touchdowns, takes on a Packers secondary that has been dealing with a lot of injuries. If in fact players like Jaire Alexander, Darnell Savage, and Eric Stokes are not able to play this upcoming week, it makes it that much more of a vulnerable secondary and defense for Patrick Mahomes to be able to dice up. Again, I understand that Patrick Mahomes hasn't lived up to the overall upside that he has in the past seasons, but he's still been a consistent quarterback, and you obviously know that you must start Patrick Mahomes if he's on your roster. Number 5, we have CJ Stroud, who has been playing incredibly well. CJ Stroud has had himself a rushing touchdown in 3 of the last 5 games. As long as you're able to get yourself a 6-point influx in those capacities, of course, your fantasy upside is only going to continue to rise within a given week. The only unfortunate part for this week is that they take on the Denver Broncos. The Denver Broncos, on a per-game basis since week 5, have allowed less than 1 touchdown per game to opposing quarterbacks. So, with that very difficult matchup on hand, again, CJ Stroud will be put to the test. He will have the return of Noah Brown potentially. Hopefully, Tank Dell and Dalton Schultz will be healthy for this upcoming week. I'm expecting by Friday for them to have full participations at practice and for CJ Stroud to definitely push this Denver Broncos defense to their overall limit. On number 6 for this week, we have Trevor Lawrence. Trevor Lawrence, speaking of scoring rushing touchdowns in regards to CJ Stroud, 3 out of the last 5 games. The last 2 games, Trevor Lawrence finding the end zone with his legs. Now, obviously, it was a quarterback sneak, 1-yard touchdown, was able to reach his arm, break the plane, and score that touchdown, stealing it from Travis Etienne. But nonetheless, he continues to play well, and as long as he's scoring fantasy points, he's a must-start. They take on the Cincinnati Bengals. Again, the Bengals offense in itself, with Jake Browning there, not going to be as effective. The Jacksonville Jaguars have been incredible in terms of stopping the run. It will absolutely force Jake Browning to throw the ball. If he makes a couple mistakes here or there, it'll allow a lot of short field opportunities for Trevor Lawrence and the Jacksonville Jaguars offense to find themselves a lot of success. And since the return of Zay Jones, we've seen a lot more production out of Trevor Lawrence. Not only is someone like Calvin Ridley playing better, but so is Trevor Lawrence. Moving on to our number 7, we have Justin Herbert. I understand that last week, very underwhelming performance of only 13 fantasy points, but again, they were taking on the Baltimore Ravens. We had them ranked low for a reason, and obviously the offense as a whole wasn't able to put much together. Either way, this week they take on the New England Patriots, one of the better matchups at the position. They're allowing over 14 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks. The expectation is that the Patriots should be starting Bailey Zappi this week. Regardless of who they're starting, Mac Jones, Bailey Zappi, interceptions will happen. And once in fact they do, Justin Herbert on a short field advantage should be able to go ahead and put a couple touchdowns into his overall score line. Moving on to our number 8, we have Brock Purdy. I understand that Brock Purdy's overall performance of 10 fantasy points last week could have been detrimental, but understand that this is the nature of the beast. When you have such a talented offense that can score on the ground as much as they do through the air, when you have guys like Christian McCaffrey and Deebo Samuel in your backfield, and they're going to just randomly score 3 rushing touchdowns within a given week, it's just a matter of the game script and how it's going to approach. There are going to be weeks in which Brock Purdy lights it up, has himself 3 passing touchdowns, 300 yards. There are going to be weeks in which just rushing touchdowns continue to pile up for the running backs within this offense. That's just the entire scheme as a whole. They take on the Eagles this week. They're the 3rd best matchup within the overall position, 17.78 fantasy points per game. I am hoping that the weather in Philly stays calm for this upcoming game because we don't want it to be a rain game. Last time we saw Brock Purdy in heavy weather conditions against Cleveland, didn't look great, but we're hoping for him to go ahead and have himself another great performance here. Moving on to our number 9, the thumbnail of today's episode, we have Sam Howell. Sam Howell continues to be a top 10 quarterback on a weekly basis in terms of his overall performances, and that's primarily because they just throw the ball the entirety of these games. He has had himself 42 minimum passing attempts in each of the last 6 games. He's putting together great performances. Luckily, last week was able to get himself 300 passing yards and score a rushing touchdown, which certainly saved his overall performance. Nonetheless, Sam Howell must start every single week, especially when they're in such a negative game script potentially against the Miami Dolphins this upcoming weekend. Moving on to our number 10, we have Kyler Murray, that since his return has happened, really has been a consistent option for fantasy purposes. Not only has he scored a rushing touchdown in 2 of the last 3 games, but he's been a top 12 quarterback in all 3 of these games for fantasy purposes. We all have to remember that Kyler Murray and his overall upside will be capped at some times, primarily because of the fact that these are the first 3 games of the season that he's played. He hasn't had the opportunity of playing preseason games or getting himself more snaps of the offense over the course of the season. He's only just finding his footing within this offense with a new offensive coordinator, and only is going to improve as we continue throughout this season. Moving on to our number 11, we have Jared Goff. Within the Detroit Lions offense, there's always going to be a guarantee that David Montgomery scores a rushing touchdown. I mean, every healthy game that David Montgomery has had, he has scored 1 rushing touchdown minimum. So as long as that's guaranteed, expect Jared Goff to have the potential of probably scoring 2 touchdowns within a given game. I mean, this is a defense with the New Orleans Saints that has allowed Gardner Minshew and Tyson Bagent to throw 2 passing touchdowns against them. And even though the New Orleans Saints defense was thought to potentially carry this team this season, that has not been the case. I'm expecting Jared Goff to have himself a solid performance, probably 250 yards, 2 passing touchdowns. Moving on to our number 12, we have Russell Wilson, who's been on a 5-game winning streak throughout this span of time, averaging 16 plus fantasy points per game in a 4-point per passing touchdown league. They take on the Houston Texans. That is the 7th best matchup at the position, nearly allowing 16 fantasy points per game on average in terms of passing statistics isolated. Luckily for Russell Wilson, he's obviously got himself a lot of utilization on the ground. Last week, 34 rushing yards, 1 rushing touchdown. Again, as long as he continues to move with his legs, he'll be a great, fantastic play going into this week in an advantageous matchup. On number 13, we have Jordan Love. Again, Jordan Love is continuing to improve every single week. The fact that he was able to take it to the Detroit Lions secondary and obviously put together another big performance of 250 plus passing yards, 3 passing touchdowns, incredible. Also got himself utilization on the ground, 3 rushing attempts for 39 rushing yards. Fantastic game. It's just a matter of, can we see Jordan Love continue the streak? I mean, he's had himself 2 passing touchdowns in each of the last 3 games. Hopefully the Chiefs defense isn't going to be that difficult of a matchup to where it limits his upside. But either way, we know that Jordan Love, even if he doesn't start hot, is a great garbage time quarterback for fantasy purposes. Moving on to our number 14, we have Baker Mayfield. He has had himself 2 plus passing touchdowns in 4 of the last 5 games. Obviously, he's going to be one of these consistent quarterbacks that is a streamer option going into this week. Again, you typically don't want to start Baker Mayfield considering there's so many better options within a given weekly basis, but considering the matchup against the Carolina Panthers, the injuries to their secondary, and the fact that Baker Mayfield has honestly played extremely well as of late, I'm anticipating another big performance out of him this week. On number 15, we have Gardner Minshew. Gardner Minshew hasn't been the most consistent quarterback for fantasy purposes. He's only had 1 passing touchdown in the last 3 games, and they've won every single one of those 3 games. We know that Jonathan Taylor is going to be missing, but of course, Zach Moss will be able to pick up the scraps there. I'm anticipating this to be a victory for the Indianapolis Colts. I'm just hoping that Gardner Minshew can have a couple touchdowns within this game. Obviously, last week was able to bail out his overall performance with a rushing touchdown near the goal line. Moving on to our number 16, we have Kenny Pickett. Again, this is a very thin week due to the bye-apocalypse. No Lamar Jackson, no Justin Fields, no Josh Allen. So Kenny Pickett's the next man up. He takes on the Arizona Cardinals. It is one of the more advantageous matchups at the position. Kenny Pickett hasn't thrown an interception in 208 passing attempts. Is there a possibility in which this offense just rushes and has rushing touchdowns only? Yes. Najee Harris, Jalen Warren can both easily score all the touchdowns within this given week, but I'm anticipating that with the overall success of this offense, they'll continue to throw the ball down in the red zone. If Deontay Johnson last week catches that receiving touchdown 15 yards, he doesn't bobble it, Kenny Pickett finishes with 16 fantasy points. And at this week, we probably wouldn't be doubting the start going into the overall matchup, but considering it is a dumpster fire of a defense and Kenny Pickett is playing better without Matt Canada, I'm expecting him to have a huge week here against the Arizona Cardinals defense. With that all covered, let's now transition into talking about some underdog pick'ems going into tonight's game between the Dallas Cowboys and Seattle Seahawks before we go ahead and sign out. Over the course of this entire season, Thursday night football games have not been fun. They haven't been fun watches overall because primarily both these teams struggled. But in many of those overall circumstances, it's because of a short week. You played on a Sunday, you got to once again play on a Thursday, you're battered, you're bruised, and obviously the overall play that we've seen from these teams just haven't lived up to the overall hype. But these are 2 teams that are coming off of 7 days of rest. The last time they played was last Thursday, Thanksgiving Day. So they definitely have more rest. They're not coming off a Sunday performance, and we should see better games from both these overall teams. My anticipation going into this game is that the Seattle Seahawks will have to throw the ball a bunch of times in order to succeed. I'm anticipating that Geno Smith is going to be able to eclipse 34.5 passing attempts. There is no way that the Seattle Seahawks can win this game unless, of course, there's a multitude of turnovers from the Dallas Cowboys, which, of course, they're playing at an all-time high as of late. But unless something of that extent occurs, there is a very low likelihood that Geno Smith can come away with a victory without throwing the ball a bunch of times within this given game. Obviously, last week only had himself 27 passing attempts. That game got out of hand relatively quickly, and obviously he was still coming off of that tricep injury, has a full week of rest rather than a short week, should be fully ready to go within the overall matchup. I'm anticipating him to go ahead and throw the ball a bunch. I don't know how much success he'll find with these overall passing attempts, but he'll definitely have more than 35.5. Now, another play that I could consider going into today's game is in regards to Jason Myers. I'm not going to go ahead and put this within this slip, but I could put it in another one. 1.5 field goals made. He has had himself 10 field goals made in just the last 3 games. Yes, he misses a couple field goals here and there, but he does go ahead and get a lot of opportunity in these circumstances. 2 field goals made minimum in each of the last 3 games could be in line for a great overall performance in that overall capacity, considering, again, they are in Dallas. The offense could sputter and lead to a lot of field goals. There won't be any weather concerns in terms of pushing the ball one way or the other. Jason Myers should be a pretty solid play in that overall circumstance. Now, when we talk about the other side of the football, we have guys like Dak Prescott, CeeDee Lamb, Tony Pollard, who as of late have all played extremely well. If I'm going to kind of suggest one of these overall plays, I mean, we're talking about CeeDee Lamb, a guy who has had himself quite literally 5 receiving touchdowns in the last 5 games. I believe CeeDee Lamb is going to be able to haul in a touchdown today. I mean, it could be a rushing touchdown, could be a receiving touchdown. A couple weeks back on an end around, ended up scoring a rushing touchdown. I expect him to find the end zone this week and have himself a great performance. Those are the 2 plays that I primarily like. Obviously, Geno Smith, higher than 34.5 passing attempts, and of course, CeeDee Lamb going higher than 0.5 rushing or receiving touchdowns. I do like the idea of Tony Pollard going higher than his overall rushing yards. I'll probably put another split together with Jason Myers going higher on his field goals made and Tony Pollard going higher on his rushing yards accumulated, 62.5. So those are the 2 slips that I'll go ahead and put together tonight. That'll cover for me tonight. Thank you, everybody, for watching. I'll be back tomorrow with some hidden gems for week 13 to, of course, help you out throughout this bipocalypse. Until next time, thank you, everybody, for watching. Click the like button, subscribe if you haven't yet already, and I'll see you guys later. Peace.